Welcome back to this new podcast on your Superdoc Insights. Invisible enemies, whether they are viruses, bacteria, or emotional struggles, have the power to wreak havoc on our lives. Today, I want to take you on a journey. First, into the ICU, where the fear of infection is an ever present threat, and then deeper into the invisible emotional enemies that quietly shape our lives. We will explore how these invisible forces impact us and how we can fight back both physically and mentally. Let me start by sharing a real story that just occurred a day back in my ICU. One of my residents, while suctioning an endotracheal tube of a HIV positive patient on a ventilator, during the process, some respiratory secretions splashed into her eyes. Instantly, I heard there was fear and panic. How do we react to this situation? What do I say to this resident? It's not just about the risk of infection, which we know statistically is low, but about the fear that accompanies that 1 in 100 chance. Ask yourself, how would you react in this situation? Would your heart race? Would your mind start thinking about the worst possible outcomes? Would you start to remember all those HIV patients you have treated before and the complications they went through? It's a flood of emotions that overtakes you: fear, anxiety, and doubt. Even though we have the post-exposure prophylaxis and all the protective protocols in place, when something like this happens, none of that logic can calm the storm in your head. In those first few minutes after the exposure, you are no longer a doctor. You are a vulnerable human being, deeply aware of your own fragility. Now let's take this further. Imagine you're working in an ICU full of patients carrying multi-drug resistant organisms, MDR bacteria. You know intellectually that these bugs are invisible, but you also know that they are powerful enough to kill. Each time you enter that ICU, there's a silent battle going on inside you. What if you get infected? What if the antibiotics don't work on you? We doctors know all too well the risks we take every day. Now, I want you to reflect. How do you react when you are exposed to risk? Whether it's an infection, a challenge, or even a conflict. How do you deal with the invisible threats that surround you? What's your first emotional reaction? Fear, stress, or maybe anger? For many of us, the fear isn't about the physical danger, it's the mental toll, the thoughts that creep in afterward. What if I get sick? How will I explain this to my family? Will I be judged for contracting a disease like HIV or tuberculosis? Let me take you back to the height of the COVID pandemic. As a third year resident in a government hospital, I was placed in a SARI wards where I saw patients coming in like soldiers entering a battlefield. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and emotionally draining. I remember donning the PPE suit, knowing all full well that it wasn't foolproof. Every doctor I knew had faced a PPE breach at some point, whether it was a torn glove or a small opening in the mask. I saw many of my juniors working tirelessly, not thinking about the risk they were taking. But I knew the fear was there. How could it not be? It wasn't about getting infected ourselves. It was about being silent vectors for the virus. For many of us, the worst fear wasn't even about our own lives. It was about what would happen if we pass the virus on to our families. Soldiers are prepared to sacrifice their own lives, but the guilt that comes from thinking you might be the one who infects your loved ones, that's much harder to bear. Even though I'm the kind of a person who likes to appear strong, I won't lie. COVID shook me to my core. Some doctors, despite their fear, pushed through and fought bravely on the front lines. Others couldn't take the risk, especially those who had pre-existing health conditions or family responsibilities. And that's okay too. The fear of the unknown, especially when the stakes are as high as life and death, can cripple anyone. Let me ask you this. During the pandemic, how did you handle the fear? Did you step forward or did you step back? And if you did step back, do you feel guilty for it? There's no right or wrong answer here, just an opportunity to explore your reaction. Fear, like an infection, spreads quickly, and just like an invisible virus, it latches onto your mind, feeding off your doubts. But have you ever stopped to think about how fear really affects you? Physically, mentally, and how it impacts you in relationships with others? Think about it. Now let's shift gears and talk about the invisible enemies within us, our emotional struggles, our mental battles. During residency, I was constantly getting triggered. For me, my biggest invisible enemy was anger. I didn't realize how much it was eating away at me until one of my mentors helped me see it clearly. Anger was like a hidden infection. It lays dormant until something or someone triggered it. And when it flared up, it wasn't just an emotional reaction. It took a toll on my health, my weight, my skin, my digestive system. It was like I was carrying this invisible burden with me. And every time I got stressed, the anger would flare up, harming me more than anyone else. For me, it took facing that anger head on to start healing. I began practicing an exercise called the dump and burn. I would write down everything that made me angry, all my frustrations, and then I would burn the paper. It was symbolic, yes, but also deeply therapeutic. Each time I did it, I felt lighter, more in control. Take a moment to reflect on your invisible enemies. What's your internal infection? Is it anger like mine? Is it fear, self-doubt, or maybe even anxiety? How does it affect your life, your health, your relationships, your mental well-being? These invisible emotions can be just as dangerous as any virus or bacteria. They lie in wait, ready to flare up when you least expect it. But just like we have protocols to handle infections, we need to manage our emotions too. In the ICU, we have PPE, masks, gloves, and sanitizers to protect ourselves from the infections. But what do we have to protect ourselves from the emotional contaminants we pick up every day? The doubts, the fears, the negativity that other people project onto us. How do we sanitize our minds from those? For me, the dump and burn exercise was a start. But it's not the only way. We need to regularly check in with ourselves, monitor the trends, in our mental health just like we monitor a patient's vitals. If you ignore the signs, whether it's anger, stress, or doubt, they will start to eat away at you. Think of it like triaging your emotions. Some emotions need immediate attention, others can be put on hold, but all of them need to be dealt with eventually. And just like in ICU, if you don't address the issue early, things can get critical very quickly. What emotional protocols do you have in place? How do you handle stress, anger, or fear? And if you don't have a system yet, what can you start doing today to protect your emotional health? Maybe it's journaling, maybe it's meditation, or maybe it's simply taking a walk to clear your mind. Whether they are viruses, bacteria, or emotions, invisible enemies have a way of creeping into our lives, but they don't have to control us. The first step is awareness, recognizing the enemies that exist within and around us. Once you identify them, you can begin to develop your own personal protocols to deal with them. Remember the invisible enemies in your life, whether they are microorganisms or your own emotional struggles, they are real. But so is your ability to fight back. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Stay balanced, stay vigilant, and take care of yourself.